Okay, we continue with our series where we talk about Stoicism, going over the entire Enchiridion and the translation How to Be Free by Professor A. A. Lawn. And we had ended up with chapter 49, and I would like to combine chapters 49 and 50 today because that made sense to me. I'll start by reading you chapter 49. Now, before we start, this mentions Chrysippus, and I should say that, in case you're unfamiliar with Chrysippus, he was the third head of the Stoa: Zeno, Cleanthes, and then Chrysippus. And Chrysippus was known as a prolific author who, according to Diogenes Laertius, a doxographer who wrote about his life, I think Diogenes mentioned something like 705 books, so that would be scrolls, that Chrysippus wrote. And it's often said that without Chrysippus there would be no Stoa, because he wrote so prolifically. But not just that, he also defended Stoicism from other schools of philosophy that criticized it, and he was a very fervent defendant of Stoicism, of his school he led. He also contributed tremendously to Stoic logic, for example. So we really owe a lot to Chrysippus. I just want to tell you that so you have a bit of context about how this chapter starts. Chapter 49. Whenever people take pride in their ability to understand and explain Chrysippus's books, say to yourself, if Chrysippus had not written obscurely, they would have nothing to be proud of. What do I want then for myself? I want to understand nature and follow its lead. So I look for someone to interpret nature for me, and on hearing that Chrysippus can do that, I go to him. But I don't understand his writings. So I look for an interpreter of them. Thus far, there is nothing for me to take pride in. After I have found the interpreter, I have to put the precepts into practice. That is the only thing to be proud of. But if what impresses me is just the interpreting itself, I have ended up as a literary scholar and not a philosopher, except that I am interpreting Chrysippus instead of Homer. Rather than showing pride, therefore, when I am asked to expound Chrysippus, I blush at my inability to exhibit the sort of actions that would match his statements. Yeah, I think this chapter again emphasizes the pragmatic nature of Stoicism. Stoicism is a philosophy that is to be lived, that has principles that are to be lived. And saying, well, I can liberally quote from, say, Epictetus or Marcus Aurelius or Seneca, Musonius, Rufus, well, or any other Stoic or any philosopher or any author for that sense, it doesn't matter. What matters is that you put those principles into practice, and that is much harder. So I know we already had a video on talking the talk versus walking the walk, and Stoicism really requires that of you. It does not suffice to say, well, Marcus Aurelius said this and this and that, and then you go around and you completely, do something utterly unvirtuous. That's not how this works. If you want to be a Stoic, and if you want to really apply the principles of Stoicism to your life, you have to do just that. You have to apply these principles. It does not work to say, I'm a Stoic because I can quote Marcus Aurelius and I have read the Enchiridion and now I'm a Stoic. And then you do everything that is utterly unstoic, right? It doesn't work. So I agree with that point, and I see what at least I think I see what he's trying to say. It is one thing to say, well, I've read all of Chrysippus' works, which in reality, by the way, you cannot do this day and age because almost all of his books are destroyed. We only have some fragments. But the point, of course, is there. He raises a very valid point. You can have someone explain Chrysippus to you and then think, oh, that's really awesome. I have had Chrysippus explained to me. Now I'm an expert on Stoicism. But that's not impressive. What was impressive was the person explaining Chrysippus to you. If you don't put any of Chrysippus's advice into practice, you have nothing to be proud of. All you have done is you've had someone explain something to you. You can be proud when you start to actually put these things into practice, and that, to be honest, is a lot harder, right? That's the really difficult part. And I think this also ties in a little bit to the difference between my grandma. I once had a discussion with her about this, and she said, well, I make the distinction between scholarship, which is knowledge you get from books, and actual wisdom, which is actually being able to apply things, give people advice that is helpful, that may be useful to them. Those two things are not the same. And you can have someone who has read hundreds or maybe a few thousand of books and has a lot of book knowledge, but that does not make that person a wise person. And I've always thought that that is a very apt description. Now, in my everyday life, I'm an instructor at a college, and that means that I teach students, and I see this in the way some students approach things as well. So I'll give you a concrete example. We teach a course in introductory psychology, and we teach students about, let's say, the action potential, the way that brain cells communicate. And that is a very biological process that has chemistry in it, and that has biology in it, and it's quite difficult, especially if you see that for the first time. It deals with ion channels and potassium and sodium and all kinds of different channels opening at different points in time, and then sodium rushes in and potassium flows out, and it's super confusing, and yet most students pass the test. But then they get to more advanced courses on the brain, and it turns out that they can sometimes, with exceptions obviously, but sometimes reproduce an action potential, but it's clear that they do not understand what really happens. All they have done is memorize the steps of, well, at this point in time, voltage-gated sodium channels open and sodium flows in or out of the cell. I actually forgot. All I remember is that there was something with sodium, and then later there's something with potassium flowing in or out of the cell. I don't know. So they have steps remembered, but they have no true comprehension of why those steps matter. And those steps matter because of other processes in your brain, like, say, long-term potentiation, which is not necessarily in you don't have to consider that in terms of action potentials, but it builds forth on the principles we have taught you about in the action potential. And long-term potentiation has something to do with, we think, how we learn. So that one way you could represent learning in the brain. Now, the reason I give you this extensive example is that is the same thing. You can memorize certain things, but until you actually understand them and are able to apply them, you're not entirely there where you should be. And whether that is, in this case, psychology or cognitive neuroscience, or whether it is philosophy, it's the same principle. It's one thing to say things, it's another thing to actually apply those things. And being able to quote something does not mean you understand what you are quoting or that you even apply this. Now, fortunately, in the next much shorter chapter, Epictetus actually gives us a very nice sort of guideline on how to do this. Chapter 50, in all your projects, keep to them as laws that it would be totally wrong to transgress. And as to anything that people may say about you, ignore it, because it doesn't belong to you. And that, I think, is very nice. That's a very good way, because one very important project in this context would be to apply Stoic principles to your life so that you can be happier in life, right? And this is a very good way to do it. If you don't know what to do, then you need to read more Stoicism. If you do know what to do, but you're not sure whether to apply it, or you don't apply it, then look at things this way. You could consider these Stoic principles to be a law. And I'm not saying that you have to be super rigid about this, but this can help you. If you feel like you're about to do something because, for example, you're emotional and you want to just quickly do this thing, but you also know sort of there's this little voice in the back of your head telling you probably shouldn't do this, you know this would not be a Stoic thing to do, then think of the principle, the Stoic principle, as a law. You wouldn't transgress a law. You wouldn't rob a bank. You wouldn't run a red light. You wouldn't speed. You wouldn't do any of those things because that's against the law, right? Some of these examples were a bit more extreme than others, but you wouldn't mug someone or hurt someone physically or maybe even emotionally, but let's make this really law-bound. You wouldn't do that because it would be against the law. If you consider a Stoic principle the same way, those are laws. Some things are within your control, some things are not. I give an emotion assent, or I do not give an emotion assent. right? I desire things that are only within my control, not those things that are outside my control. Now we're talking. If you consider those to be laws for your life, well, you wouldn't break a law very easily. And as a result, you can put into practice what you have learned more easily because there's no other way. Again, you wouldn't break a law. So I really like that short 50th chapter. That's a very nice way to look at things, and that serves as a good reminder to yourself that that is how things are, and that is, the way you should be doing things. It's the law. And again, be a little careful because, of course, you don't want to turn this into some sort of utterly strict dogma that you cannot deviate from. But again, a lot of these principles, like things within your control, things outside your control, make a lot of sense, and I think you agree. Otherwise, you wouldn't keep watching these videos, right? So, the law. I hope this was useful. Next time we'll look at 2 chapters again, and I'll gladly see you then. Bye-bye.